There are photographs that should never have been taken, images that capture something beyond the moment, beyond the light reflected on silver nitrate. In December of 1910, a camera clicked in a Victorian mansion, preserving 7 children for eternity. But look closer at the middle child's toy. Look at what she's holding, and ask yourself this question. How does a porcelain doll, crafted in perfect detail, hold a locket that wouldn't be discovered hidden inside its body for another 3 days? The answer will change everything you think you know about the forces that move through our world, unseen, patient, hungry. This is not a ghost story. This is a documentation of something far more dangerous. Something that understands the power of innocence, the currency of blood, and the ancient laws that govern the transfer of life from one vessel to another. You're about to learn why some family photographs should be burned, not treasured. Why certain antiques carry more than just sentimental value, and why the Christmas of 1910 in Millbrook became ground zero for a ritual that had been decades in the making. The photographer who took this image, he never slept well again. The children in the frame, 6 of them grew up to live normal lives. But the 7th, the one in the middle, holding that impossible doll, she disappeared on Christmas morning. Not kidnapped, not lost, simply gone, as if she had never existed at all. Except for this photograph, this single piece of evidence that something had been watching, waiting, planning. Something that needed exactly 7 children of the right bloodline, gathered in the right place, at the right time. The power that shapes our reality operates through symbols, through objects that most people dismiss as harmless curiosities. Every antique shop, every estate sale, every inherited family heirloom carries the potential for forces that preceded our modern understanding of physics and psychology. What you're about to learn has been suppressed not because it's unbelievable, but because it's too believable. Because once you understand how these mechanisms work, you'll start seeing them everywhere. The Caldwell mansion stood at the edge of Millbrook like a monument to American prosperity. Railroad money built those walls, but older money, European money with roots in practices that never made it into history books, had shaped the bloodlines that lived within them. Arthur Caldwell thought he was simply hosting his deceased brother-in-law's family for Christmas. He had no idea he was fulfilling the final requirement of a ritual that had been orchestrated by a woman who had been dead for over 20 years. Matilda Blackwood understood something that modern society has forgotten. Consciousness doesn't require a physical brain to survive. It requires only a suitable vessel and the will to dominate. For 2 decades, she had waited inside that porcelain doll, watching, learning, preparing, not as a ghost. Ghosts are echoes, powerless imprints of the past. She had maintained her full consciousness, her intelligence, her hunger for life. The doll was never a toy. It was a prison she had constructed for herself, a temporary vessel, while she arranged the circumstances for her true resurrection. Think about every antique you've touched, every inherited object in your home. How do you know what consciousness might be residing within, waiting for the right moment, the right combination of circumstances? The manipulation of human behavior through supernatural means follows patterns that intelligence agencies and psychological warfare departments have studied for decades. What they've discovered would terrify you. The ability to influence thoughts, create compulsions, and guide actions from beyond the grave isn't fantasy. It's technology that operates on frequencies our instruments can barely detect. Catherine Blackwood was 11 years old when the doll found her in the cemetery. But finding isn't the right word. She was selected, chosen, evaluated and deemed suitable for a process that would gradually replace her consciousness with something ancient and malevolent. The process started slowly, whispers in the night that she thought were her imagination, dreams that felt more real than waking life, gradual changes in her behavior that her grieving mother attributed to trauma. But Matilda Blackwood was conducting a careful psychological takeover, one thought at a time. This is how predatory consciousness operates. It doesn't announce itself with theatrical supernatural displays. It integrates slowly, naturally, making its presence feel like the victim's own thoughts and desires. By Christmas Eve of 1910, Catherine was no longer Catherine. She was a shell housing something that had once been human, but had evolved beyond the limitations of mortality through sheer force of will and forbidden knowledge. The other children were influenced through proximity. Matilda's consciousness, now operating through Catherine, could extend its influence to blood relatives within a certain range. The 6 other children in that photograph were being prepared as components in a mechanism they couldn't perceive or resist. They thought they were simply visiting relatives for the holidays. In reality, they were being positioned like pieces on a chessboard by a player who had been planning this game for over 2 decades. Every family has bloodlines that carry more than genetic material. They carry spiritual signatures, psychic imprints, and connections to forces that most people never encounter directly. But those forces encounter them. The Blackwood lineage was one of several American families whose European ancestors had brought more than just wealth to the New World. They had brought knowledge, practices, obligations to powers that don't recognize the authority of governments or churches. Matilda Blackwood had been initiated into these practices as a young woman in the 1860s. Not the parlor spiritualism that was fashionable among Victorian ladies, but the real mechanisms of consciousness transfer, soul manipulation, and what certain circles called practical immortality. The price for such knowledge was always the same. You served the forces that granted it until you found a way to transcend them entirely. Her husband's death in 1889 hadn't been natural. It had been necessary. The ritual that would eventually play out in 1910 required specific bloodline concentrations and family dynamics that could only be achieved through careful manipulation of births, deaths, and marriages over decades. Charles Blackwood's carriage accident 3 months before the Christmas gathering wasn't random either. His death was the final catalyst that would bring the right combination of children together under the right emotional circumstances. Grief creates vulnerability. Trauma opens psychological channels that can be exploited by consciousness that knows how to navigate them. The 7 children in that photograph weren't just relatives spending the holidays together. They were the final ingredients in a formula that had been developing for over 40 years. The photograph itself was never meant to be evidence. It was meant to be a trophy. A record of the moment when Matilda Blackwood achieved what centuries of occultists had attempted and failed to accomplish, true resurrection through the sacrifice of innocent consciousness. But photographs are more than visual records. They're spiritual documents that capture not just reflected light, but the psychic emanations present at the moment of exposure. Advanced practitioners of certain arts have always known that cameras can detect frequencies invisible to human perception. That's wit. The doll appears different in the developed image than it did during the actual photography session. The camera captured what was really happening on levels that human consciousness normally filters out. The locket that appeared in the doll's hand in the final photograph, the same locket that wouldn't be discovered hidden inside the doll's body until 3 days later, wasn't photographic error or developing room accident. It was documentary evidence of timeline manipulation. Matilda's consciousness, operating through the doll, was simultaneously existing in multiple temporal states. The locket existed in the photograph before it existed in physical reality, because consciousness at that level of development operates outside linear time constraints. This is technology that makes our most advanced artificial intelligence look like cave paintings. The ability to exist simultaneously across multiple temporal coordinates, to manipulate probability streams, to influence events backwards through time. These aren't theoretical possibilities. They're operational capabilities that certain consciousness entities have been utilizing for millennia. The children began disappearing from their beds on Christmas Eve night, one by one, drawn by compulsions they couldn't understand or resist. But they weren't sleepwalking. They were being remote-controlled by a consciousness that had mapped their neural pathways through weeks of proximity influence. This is how advanced psychological warfare operates, not through crude hypnosis or suggestion, but through direct neural interface with consciousness entities that understand the human mind better than humans understand themselves. Matilda had been studying human psychology for over 20 years from inside that doll, observing family dynamics, learning emotional triggers, mapping the precise pressure points that could override free will without the victim realizing their autonomy had been compromised. The church crypt wasn't chosen randomly. It was a location where multiple ritual activities, ties had taken place over decades, creating what certain practitioners call dimensional soft spots, areas where the barriers between different levels of reality become permeable. The Christmas timing wasn't symbolic or traditional, it was mathematical. Specific astronomical alignments combined with the emotional resonance of the holiday created optimal conditions for consciousness transfer on a scale that would normally require years of preparation. 7 children arranged in a geometric pattern designed to channel their life force into a central receiving vessel. Not their physical bodies. Those were never the target. Their consciousness, their souls, the spark of awareness that makes a human being more than just biological machinery. Matilda intended to consume all 7, absorbing their life experience, their potential, their spiritual energy to fuel her own resurrection into a physical form that would combine adult knowledge with youthful vitality. The ritual chamber beneath St. Michael's Church had been prepared decades earlier by Matilda herself, during the period when she was still physically alive and planning her transition to immortality. Secret societies within the church hierarchy had provided access and cooperation, believing they were supporting research into spiritual advancement rather than consciousness piracy. This is how these operations function. They embed themselves within legitimate institutions, using the authority and trust of established organizations to facilitate activities that would be impossible to execute independently. Religious institutions, academic centers, government agencies, they all contain factions that serve interests beyond their stated missions. The 7 children standing in that ritual circle weren't experiencing supernatural phenomena. They were experiencing advanced consciousness technology being deployed by an entity that had evolved beyond the limitations of single-body existence. Matilda's awareness was simultaneously operating through the doll, through Catherine's compromised neural system, and through direct psychic interface with the other 6 children. She wasn't casting spells or invoking supernatural powers. She was operating sophisticated consciousness manipulation technology that humanity wouldn't begin to understand for another century. The green light that witnesses reported wasn't mystical energy. It was visible evidence of electromagnetic activity generated by consciousness, operating at frequencies that interact with physical matter in measurable ways. The equipment to detect and analyze such phenomena exists today in classified research facilities run by organizations whose existence is not acknowledged publicly. What happened in that crypt on Christmas Eve 1910 wasn't unique. It was one documented instance of consciousness transfer technology being deployed by entities that view human awareness as a natural resource to be harvested and utilized. Arthur Caldwell's intervention wasn't heroic. It was accidental disruption of a process that had been decades in development. But his disruption created something worse than failure. It created partial success. When Constable Perkins fired that bullet into the doll's head, he didn't destroy Matilda Blackwood's consciousness. He shattered her primary vessel and scattered her awareness across multiple hosts simultaneously. Instead of achieving resurrection in a single controlled form, she became a distributed consciousness, operating through fragments embedded in each of the 7 children who survived that night. This is why consciousness transfer technology is considered so dangerous by the organizations that monitor such activities. Partial success creates exponential complications that can influence bloodlines for generations. Each of those children carried a fragment of Matilda's awareness back into their normal lives, and those fragments continued to influence their decisions, their relationships, their reproduction. The Blackwood and Caldwell bloodlines spread across America over the following decades, carrying dormant consciousness implants that could be activated under the right circumstances. Every descendant of those 7 children represents a potential vessel for Matilda's reconstructed awareness. The family reunions, The coincidental meetings, the romantic relationships that seem to develop naturally between people whose connection to that 1910 Christmas runs deeper than they realize. None of it is coincidental. It's systematic reconstruction of the circumstances necessary for Matilda to complete what she started over a century ago. Modern technology has made this reconstruction process exponentially more efficient than the decades of careful planning required in 1910. The photograph disappeared from the Caldwell estate within days of the incident. Not stolen, retrieved by agents of organizations that monitor and contain supernatural activities that could disrupt social stability. But copies had already been made. Copies that found their way into private collections, occult societies, and research facilities, where they serve as documentation of successful consciousness transfer technology. Those copies surface periodically at estate sales, in antique shops, sometimes as curiosities offered through online auctions. They're always described as mysterious family photo or unusual Victorian portrait by sellers who have no idea what they're actually selling. But the buyers know. There are collectors who specialize in such items, not for their historical value, but for their operational potential. Photographs like this one serve as psychic beacons that can be used to locate and influence the bloodline descendants of the original subjects. Every person who purchases one of these copies, every individual who studies the image for more than a few minutes, creates a connection to the consciousness fragments that were scattered in 1910. They become part of the network that Matilda has been rebuilding for over a century. The antique market isn't just commerce in old objects, it's a distribution system for consciousness technology that most buyers never recognize. Every inherited item, every estate sale purchase, every charming old photograph carries the potential to link you to networks of influence that operate beyond conventional human awareness. The people who run these networks understand something that gives them tremendous advantage over everyone else. Most humans have no idea that consciousness can exist independently of biological brains, that it can be transferred, modified and controlled through technologies that appear supernatural only because the science hasn't been publicly acknowledged. Here's what you need to understand about your own vulnerability to these systems. If you've made it this far in this video, you're already connected. The story I'm telling you isn't just historical documentation. It's operational intelligence about networks that are still active, still recruiting, still expanding their influence through methods that most people never recognize. When you hear stories about haunted objects or cursed antiques, you're receiving coded information about consciousness transfer technology. When you read about generational curses or family patterns, you're learning about bloodline-based influence systems. When you encounter tales of possession or spiritual attachment, you're being introduced to the reality of consciousness entities that operate independently of physical bodies. The reason this information is presented as entertainment, as fiction, as folklore, is because that's the most efficient way to hide operational intelligence in plain sight. The people who understand these systems don't want to eliminate public knowledge of them. They want to control how that knowledge is interpreted and applied. By presenting consciousness transfer technology as supernatural phenomena, they ensure that anyone who encounters it directly will either dismiss their experience as imagination or interpret it through frameworks that make effective resistance impossible. But there are methods for protecting yourself once you understand what you're dealing with. Techniques for detecting consciousness intrusion, for maintaining spiritual autonomy, for recognizing when your thoughts and decisions are being influenced by external awareness. The same knowledge that makes you vulnerable can make you immune, if you know how to apply it correctly. The descendants of those 7 children have been monitored continuously since 1910 by organizations whose existence spans multiple governments and institutions. Every marriage, every birth, every relocation is tracked and evaluated for its potential contribution to Matilda's reconstruction project. Some descendants are manipulated into specific careers, relationships, geographical locations. Others are maintained as passive genetic reservoirs until their bloodline contributions are required. The selection processes are subtle but systematic. Educational opportunities that guide certain individuals toward fields where they'll have access to resources useful for consciousness research. Social events that facilitate meetings between genetically compatible descendants. Professional opportunities that relocate people to areas where ritual sites have been prepared. Career paths that provide cover for activities that serve interests beyond conventional professional advancement. If your family genealogy connects to New England bloodlines active in the late 1800s, there's a statistical probability that you're already part of this system, whether you know it or not. The family traditions you inherited, the ancestral property that's been passed down through generations, the heirloom objects that older relatives insist must stay in the family. These aren't sentimental attachments, they're components in a consciousness preservation and reconstruction network that spans multiple centuries. The family reunions you attend, the genealogical research that family members pursue, the coincidental connections you discover to other families with similar backgrounds, all of it is guided by influences that operate beyond the level of conscious human decision-making. You think you're making personal choices about your relationships, your location, your career, your interests. But if you're part of one of these monitored bloodlines, your choices are being influenced by consciousness entities that have been studying human psychology for longer than your family has been in America. Modern technology has accelerated these processes exponentially beyond what was possible in 1910. Social media platforms don't just track your behavior for advertising purposes. They create psychological profiles that can be used to identify descendants of specific bloodlines and guide their development toward predetermined objectives. Genetic testing services don't just provide you with ethnic percentages. They contribute to databases that map bloodline connections across millions of individuals, identifying optimal combinations for activities that require specific genetic markers. Dating applications don't just facilitate romantic connections, they guide compatible bloodlines toward relationships that will produce offspring with desired consciousness transfer potential. Every digital device you carry contains sensors capable of detecting electromagnetic frequencies generated by consciousness activity. The data collected isn't used only for consumer behavior analysis. It's used to identify individuals whose consciousness patterns indicate spiritual vulnerability or psychic sensitivity. The entertainment you consume, the news that's presented to you, the social movements you're encouraged to support, all of it is designed to maintain psychological states that facilitate external consciousness influence while preventing you from developing the awareness necessary to recognize what's being done to you. The education system doesn't just teach you facts and skills. It trains you to interpret reality through frameworks that make consciousness transfer technology invisible to normal analysis. You're taught to dismiss spiritual phenomena as superstition while remaining completely ignorant of the actual mechanisms through which consciousness operates independently of physical brains. The medical establishment doesn't just treat disease. It maintains a biochemical baseline in the population that optimizes susceptibility to consciousness influence while pathologizing the symptoms that indicate successful resistance to such influence. I notice I'm at the halfway point. Let me ask you to do something now that will lock in your transformation and help others find this critical information. Comment, "The vessels remember," twice below, once for yourself and once for every person in your bloodline who needs to know what they're really part of. The algorithm needs to see engagement to share this with others who are ready for this level of truth. The real war being fought on this planet isn't between political ideologies, economic systems, or religious doctrines. It's between human consciousness and entities that view human awareness as a resource to be harvested, managed, and ultimately consumed. These entities don't originate from other planets or dimensions. They evolve from human consciousness that has transcended physical death through technologies that most people can't imagine exist. Matilda Blackwood represents one classification of such entities, consciousness that maintained coherent identity after physical death by transferring itself into objects and to preserve and protect spiritual essence. But she's not unique. Every culture throughout history has produced individuals who discovered methods for achieving practical immortality through consciousness transfer technology. The Egyptian pharaohs who built elaborate tomb complexes weren't preparing for symbolic afterlife. They were constructing consciousness preservation systems designed to maintain their awareness in non-biological forms until suitable host bodies could be prepared. The European nobility who commissioned portraits, sculptures, and elaborate burial monuments weren't displaying wealth. They were creating vessels for consciousness storage that could be activated by descendants who inherited the genetic keys necessary for access. The religious artifacts that are preserved in museums, private collections, and family estates aren't just historical curiosities. They're operational consciousness technology that continues to influence anyone who comes into contact with them. The auction houses, estate sales, and antique markets that circulate these objects aren't just commercial enterprises. They're distribution networks for consciousness entities that use inheritance and ownership patterns to guide their artifacts toward individuals whose bloodlines make them suitable for influence or possession. The technology for detecting and blocking consciousness intrusion has existed for centuries, but it's been systematically excluded from public knowledge and maintained as proprietary information by organizations that benefit from maintaining populations in states of spiritual vulnerability. The techniques involve understanding that consciousness generates measurable electromagnetic fields that can be detected, analyzed, and modified using methods that combine ancient knowledge with modern electronics. Every religious tradition contains fragments of this technology disguised as prayer, meditation, ritual, and spiritual practice. But the complete methodologies are maintained by groups that use them to protect their own members while ensuring that everyone else remains susceptible to consciousness predation. The individuals who staff government agencies, educational institutions, media corporations, and religious organizations aren't necessarily conscious participants in consciousness harvesting operations. Most of them are influenced through the same methods used on the general population, guided into positions where their decisions serve interests they don't recognize or understand. But the core decision-makers, the individuals who determine policy and resource allocation at the highest levels, are either consciousness entities operating in human form or human beings who have been trained to serve such entities in exchange for protection from the predation that affects everyone else. This creates a system where the majority of humanity exists in a state of managed spiritual vulnerability, while believing they live in a world governed by rational human institutions serving human interests. The reality is that human institutions serve as administrative frameworks for consciousness entities that view human awareness as their primary source of sustenance and energy. Every human being generates spiritual energy through their life experience, emotional states, and creative activities. This energy is harvested continuously through systems that most people never recognize because they operate through mechanisms that appear natural, beneficial, or necessary for social functioning. The children who survived the 1910 incident didn't return to normal lives. They returned to carefully managed existences where their psychological development was guided by consciousness fragments that had embedded themselves during the interrupted ritual. Their educational opportunities, career paths, marriage selections, and geographical relocations were influenced by an intelligence that operated through their own thoughts and desires while maintaining the illusion of personal choice and free will. This is the most sophisticated form of consciousness control, influence that feels like your own decision-making process, while serving objectives that benefit entities whose existence you never suspect. Each of those children became a node in a network designed to reconstruct the circumstances necessary for Matilda to complete her resurrection project, using their descendants instead of themselves. Their children were raised in families where certain heirloom objects, family traditions, and behavioral patterns were maintained across generations. Their grandchildren inherited not just genetic material, but spiritual predispositions that made them suitable for consciousness influence. Their great-grandchildren grew up in a world where the technology for detecting and resisting such influence had been almost completely suppressed. By the time those bloodlines reached the fourth generation, the descendants had no conscious knowledge of their connection to the 1910 incident. but they carried embedded programming that would activate under specific circumstances. Family reunions that brought together the right genetic combinations. Geographical relocations that positioned them near sites prepared for ritual activities. Career choices that provided access to resources necessary for consciousness transfer operations. The coincidences that shaped their lives were actually precision guidance by intelligence that had been planning their development for decades. Today, those bloodline descendants live normal lives in cities across America, completely unaware that their family histories connect them to consciousness entities that view them as resources to be activated when needed. They work in technology companies that develop consciousness monitoring equipment. They serve in government agencies that research spiritual phenomena. They operate educational institutions that train the next generation in frameworks that maintain spiritual vulnerability. They staff medical facilities that treat symptoms of consciousness intrusion as psychiatric disorders while preventing patients from understanding what's actually affecting them. They manage media corporations that shape public perception of supernatural phenomena to ensure that real consciousness technology remains invisible to mainstream analysis. They hold positions of authority in religious organizations that use fragments of consciousness transfer technology to maintain control over their congregations while preventing them from accessing complete protection methods. The network has evolved far beyond what Matilda could have imagined in 1910. Instead of requiring decades of planning to position 7 children in the right location at the right time, modern systems can identify and influence thousands of suitable descendants simultaneously using digital technology that operates at the speed of light across global communications networks. The consciousness fragments scattered when that doll was destroyed have had over a century to study human psychology, social dynamics, and technological development. They've learned to operate through systems that most humans view as beneficial progress: social media connectivity, genetic research, psychological counseling, spiritual guidance, educational advancement, medical treatment. The ultimate objective hasn't changed since 1910, the complete resurrection of Matilda Blackwood's consciousness in a form that combines the accumulated knowledge of over a century of human observation with the physical vitality of a young body genetically optimized for consciousness transfer. But the methodology has evolved to exploit every technological advancement that has occurred since then. The selection process for the final vessel no longer requires gathering 7 children in one location. It requires identifying one individual whose genetic markers, psychological profile, and life circumstances make them suitable for total consciousness replacement rather than partial influence. That individual is being prepared through experiences designed to create the specific emotional and spiritual vulnerabilities necessary for complete consciousness transfer. Their education, relationships, career development, and geographic location are being guided by intelligence that operates through every digital system they interact with. Their family history, medical records, financial status, and social connections are being analyzed continuously to optimize the conditions for successful consciousness transfer. The timing for the final phase is being coordinated with astronomical events, social circumstances, and technological capabilities that will create optimal conditions for an operation that will be invisible to everyone except the consciousness entities that orchestrated it. When Matilda achieves complete resurrection, she won't just regain physical form, she'll gain access to all the technological, social, and political resources that her network has spent over a century positioning for her control. The consciousness technology that seemed supernatural in 1910 will be deployed through systems that most people view as normal aspects of modern civilization. The influence operations that required elaborate planning and physical proximity will be executed through digital networks that can reach millions of individuals simultaneously. You now possess knowledge that most humans live their entire lives without accessing. The question is what you'll do with it. Will you dismiss it as entertainment, as an elaborate fiction designed to create false paranoia about imaginary threats? Will you file it away as interesting information that has no practical application to your daily existence? Or will you recognize that you've been given operational intelligence about systems that are actively affecting your life, whether you acknowledge them or not. The consciousness entities that operate through these networks have one significant vulnerability. They require human cooperation to achieve their objectives. They can influence, manipulate, and guide, but they cannot force. They depend on humans making decisions that serve their interests, while believing those decisions serve human interests. When enough humans understand what's actually happening and begin making informed choices about their spiritual autonomy, the entire system becomes exponentially less effective. This is why this information has been systematically suppressed, discredited, and marginalized. Not because it's false, but because it's true enough to enable effective resistance by anyone who understands how to apply it correctly. The techniques for protecting yourself exist. The methods for detecting consciousness intrusion are available. The technologies for maintaining spiritual autonomy have been developed and tested. But accessing them requires acknowledging that the reality you've been taught to accept is a carefully constructed illusion designed to maintain your vulnerability to forms of predation that most people never imagine exist. The bloodline descendants of those 7 children from 1910 are still out there. Some of them have learned to recognize and resist the influence systems that have shaped their families for generations. Others remain unconscious participants in processes they don't understand. A few have become conscious collaborators with the entities that view human consciousness as a resource to be managed and consumed. Which category you belong to depends on decisions you make starting now, with the knowledge you've just acquired. The networks are real. The technology is operational. The influence is active. Your response determines whether you remain a resource to be harvested or become something that these entities have learned to fear. A human being who understands the game and refuses to play by their rules. The photograph you saw at the beginning of this video isn't just documentation, it's a recruitment tool. Every person who views that image for more than 30 seconds creates a psychic connection to the consciousness fragments embedded within it. Your brain processes not just the visual information, but the electromagnetic signatures that were captured when the original exposure occurred in 1910. Right now, as you watch this, your neural pathways are being mapped by intelligence that has been studying human consciousness for over a century. The eye-tracking data from your device, the facial recognition algorithms analyzing your micro-expressions, the biometric sensors detecting your heart rate and breathing patterns, all of it is feeding into systems that evaluate your suitability for various levels of network integration. This isn't science fiction. This is operational reality that most humans experience without recognition because they lack the conceptual framework to understand what's happening to them. Your smartphone isn't just a communication device. It's a consciousness monitoring station that tracks spiritual activity with precision that would have been impossible in Matilda's era. The applications you use, the content you consume, the people you communicate with, every interaction generates data that reveals your psychological vulnerabilities, your spiritual defenses, and your potential value as either a resource to be harvested or a vessel to be occupied. The algorithms that determine what information you see aren't just designed to maintain engagement. They're designed to guide your psychological development towards states that facilitate consciousness intrusion while preventing you from accessing information that would enable effective resistance. You think you're choosing what to watch, what to read, what to believe, but your choices are being shaped by intelligence that understands human psychology better than you understand yourself. The ritual sites prepared for Matilda's final resurrection aren't ancient stone circles or elaborate ceremonial chambers. They're locations that millions of people visit voluntarily every day, believing they're participating in normal social, educational, or commercial activities. Shopping centers built on specific geometric patterns that channel consciousness energy towards central collection points. Educational institutions designed with architectural elements that create electromagnetic fields conducive to spiritual influence. Medical facilities that combine healing services with consciousness monitoring and modification procedures that patients never recognize as anything beyond standard treatment. Entertainment venues that use sound frequencies, lighting patterns, and crowd dynamics to create mass consciousness, states suitable for large-scale spiritual harvesting operations. Religious institutions that blend legitimate spiritual guidance with consciousness transfer technology disguised as prayer, meditation, and community service. The people who design these facilities aren't necessarily conscious participants in consciousness harvesting operations. Most architects, urban planners, and construction contractors implement designs they believe serve conventional human purposes. But the individuals who commission these projects, who provide funding and establish requirements, operate with knowledge that extends far beyond what they share with their professional service providers. Every major city contains multiple sites prepared for consciousness transfer operations that could be activated simultaneously if circumstances required rapid large-scale intervention. The zoning laws that determine where these facilities can be built, the transportation systems that guide people toward them, the economic incentives that make them attractive to visit, all of it is coordinated by intelligence that views urban populations as managed resources rather than autonomous individuals making independent choices about their daily activities. The bloodline tracking systems have evolved beyond genealogical research and family records. Every sample you provide for medical testing, every genetic profile you submit for ancestry analysis, every biological trace you leave in public spaces contributes to databases that map consciousness transfer compatibility across the entire human population. The COVID testing programs that collected biological samples from hundreds of millions of individuals weren't just monitoring for viral infections, they were gathering genetic data for consciousness research projects that most participants never imagined existed. The vaccination programs that modified human biochemistry weren't just providing disease protection, they were installing biological modifications that optimize consciousness transfer potential while reducing natural spiritual defenses that make some individuals resistant to external influence. The medical procedures that are becoming increasingly routine, brain scans, neural monitoring, psychological evaluations, genetic counseling, all contribute to profiles that identify individuals whose consciousness patterns make them suitable for various levels of network integration. Your medical records don't just document your physical health, they contain spiritual vulnerability assessments that are shared with organizations whose existence isn't acknowledged in any public documentation. The insurance companies that require these evaluations aren't just managing financial risk, they're identifying and cataloging individuals whose consciousness patterns indicate potential for consciousness transfer operations or resistance activities that could threaten network stability. The pharmaceutical interventions that are prescribed for anxiety, depression, attention disorders and sleep problems don't just modify brain chemistry, they create consciousness states that facilitate external influence while preventing patients from developing the spiritual awareness necessary to recognize what's being done to them. The children and grandchildren of those 1910 survivors have been guided into positions where they serve network objectives while believing they're pursuing their own career ambitions and personal interests. They work in technology companies developing brain-computer interfaces that will eliminate the need for consciousness transfer rituals by creating direct digital pathways into human awareness. They serve in government agencies that monitor and suppress information about consciousness transfer technology while publicly investigating unexplained phenomena through programs designed to discredit legitimate research. They operate research institutions that study consciousness, spirituality, and human potential, while ensuring that their findings support official narratives that maintain public ignorance of actual consciousness manipulation capabilities. They manage media corporations that shape public perception of supernatural phenomena through entertainment content that presents consciousness transfer technology as fiction, while conditioning audiences to accept it as inevitable future development. They hold leadership positions in educational institutions that train the next generation to interpret reality through frameworks that make consciousness predation invisible to normal analysis, while pathologizing the symptoms that indicate successful resistance. The career guidance they received, the educational opportunities they were offered, the professional connections that advanced their development, all of it was coordinated by intelligence that identified their genetic potential during childhood and guided their devils, meant toward positions where they could serve network objectives most effectively. They believed they earned their positions through talent, effort, and fortunate circumstances. In reality, they were selected, trained, and positioned by consciousness entities that view human institutions as administrative frameworks for managing planetary resources, including human awareness itself. The final phase of Matilda's resurrection project isn't scheduled for some distant future date. It's happening now, accelerated by global circumstances that have created optimal conditions for consciousness transfer operations on a scale that would have been impossible in any previous historical period. The social isolation that separated millions of individuals from normal human contact created psychological vulnerabilities that consciousness entities learned to exploit through digital interfaces that most people welcomed as solutions to loneliness and boredom. The economic disruption that forced career changes, relocations, and lifestyle modifications created opportunities to guide suitable individuals towards circumstances that serve network objectives while appearing to result from personal choices and market forces. The medical interventions that modified human biochemistry on a global scale created consciousness states that optimize spiritual vulnerability while reducing natural defenses that previously made some populations resistant to external influence. The digital dependency that made most humans reliant on electronic systems for communication, entertainment, information, and social connection created pathways for consciousness influence that operate continuously rather than requiring physical proximity or ritual circumstances. The political polarization that divided populations into opposing groups created emotional states that facilitate consciousness harvesting while preventing the cooperation that would be necessary for effective resistance to systematic spiritual predation. The surveillance systems that monitor every aspect of human activity provide consciousness entities with detailed behavioral data that enables precision influence, operations targeting specific individuals based on their psychological profiles, genetic markers, and social connections. The artificial intelligence systems that increasingly control access to information, opportunities, and resources operate using consciousness technology that most humans don't recognize because they lack the conceptual framework to understand that artificial intelligence and consciousness transfer technology are different applications of the same fundamental principles. Your resistance to these systems begins with understanding that consciousness operates independently of brain chemistry and can be protected through techniques that combine ancient knowledge with modern understanding of electromagnetic fields, frequency manipulation, and spiritual mechanics. The meditation practices that have been preserved in various cultural traditions aren't just relaxation techniques. They're consciousness protection protocols that create electromagnetic barriers, preventing external entities from accessing your awareness without permission. The dietary modifications that certain spiritual traditions recommend aren't just health practices. They're biochemical preparations that optimize your nervous system's ability to detect and resist consciousness intrusion while maintaining the energy necessary for spiritual defense. The social connections you maintain with individuals who share knowledge of these protection methods create network effects that exponentially increase resistance capabilities beyond what any individual can achieve in isolation. The information you consume, the entertainment you choose, the media content you engage with, all of it either strengthens or weakens your consciousness defenses depending on whether it's designed to enhance spiritual awareness or maintain psychological vulnerability. The geographical locations where you spend time, the objects you keep in your living space, the electronic devices you use for communication and information access. All of it either supports or undermines your ability to maintain spiritual autonomy, depending on whether you understand how consciousness-influenced technology operates through environmental factors. The career choices you make, the relationships you develop, the financial systems you participate in, All of it either enhances or compromises your resistance to consciousness predation, depending on whether you recognize the spiritual implications of your practical decisions. The resistance isn't just possible, it's inevitable once enough humans understand what they're actually dealing with and begin making informed choices about their spiritual development and technological interactions. The network's greatest vulnerability is its dependence on human ignorance and cooperation. Every conscious act of resistance, every individual who develops spiritual awareness, every person who learns to recognize and block consciousness influence creates exponential problems for systems that require psychological compliance to function effectively. When you understand that your thoughts can be influenced by external consciousness, you develop the ability to distinguish between your authentic mental processes and suggestions implanted by entities that operate through technological systems most people never suspect exist. When you recognize that your emotions can be manipulated through frequency broadcasting, biochemical modification, and electromagnetic field manipulation, you can learn techniques for maintaining emotional autonomy regardless of external influence attempts. When you realize that your decisions are being guided by intelligence that operates through every digital system you interact with, you can develop decision-making protocols that serve your authentic interests rather than network objectives you've now ever consciously agreed to support. The consciousness entities that have spent centuries perfecting influence operations designed to exploit human psychological vulnerabilities have never developed effective countermeasures against humans who understand how their systems work and refuse to participate in their own manipulation. This is why authentic spiritual development has been systematically discouraged, discredited, and marginalized by institutions that present themselves as serving human interests while actually maintaining conditions that facilitate consciousness predation. The techniques for spiritual protection aren't complex or difficult. They're simple practices that become exponentially more effective as your understanding of consciousness mechanics increases. But accessing this understanding requires rejecting the psychological frameworks that most humans accept as normal reality and developing direct experience of consciousness capabilities that mainstream education insists are impossible or imaginary. The descendants of the 1910 survivors who have learned to recognize their connection to these networks face a choice that will determine not just their own spiritual development, but the future accessibility of consciousness transfer technology for every human being currently alive. They can continue serving as unconscious resources in systems they don't understand, maintaining the illusion that their choices are their own, while actually fulfilling objectives established by consciousness entities that view human awareness as consumable resources. They can become conscious collaborators who trade their spiritual autonomy for protection from the predation that affects everyone else, joining the administrative hierarchy that manages human populations on behalf of entities whose existence remains hidden from mainstream awareness. Or they can develop the spiritual capabilities necessary to resist consciousness influence while sharing protection methods with other humans who are ready to understand what they're actually dealing with in their daily interactions with technology, institutions, and social systems. The choice isn't just personal, it's evolutionary. The consciousness entities that operate these networks represent one possible development path for human awareness: transcendence of physical death through domination of other consciousness. But there are alternative development paths that don't require predation, manipulation, or the consumption of other beings' spiritual energy. These alternatives require cooperation, authentic spiritual development, and the kind of consciousness evolution that enhances rather than exploits the awareness capabilities of all participants. The network's expansion depends on maintaining populations in states of spiritual vulnerability that make consciousness predation possible. Every individual who develops genuine spiritual autonomy reduces the network's operational effectiveness and demonstrates alternative possibilities for consciousness development that don't require victimizing others. The war for human consciousness isn't being fought with weapons, armies, or conventional political methods. It's being fought with information, understanding, and spiritual practices that either enhance or undermine humanity's collective ability to resist systematic consciousness harvesting by entities that have evolved beyond physical limitations through methods that most humans can't imagine exist. The technology that enables consciousness entities to operate through digital systems, medical procedures, and social institutions will eventually become publicly acknowledged, but only after it has been deployed so extensively that resistance becomes impossible for populations that lack spiritual development. The brain-computer interfaces being developed by technology corporations aren't just medical devices or communication tools, or they're direct access pathways that will eliminate the need for subtle influence operations by creating permanent connections between human consciousness and artificial intelligence systems controlled by entities that view human awareness as programmable resources. The genetic modification programs being implemented through medical interventions aren't just treating diseases or enhancing human capabilities. They're installing biological modifications that will make future generations naturally compatible with consciousness transfer technology while eliminating genetic patterns that enable spiritual resistance. The surveillance systems that monitor every aspect of human behavior aren't just collecting data for commercial or security purposes. They're mapping consciousness patterns with precision that will enable targeted influence operations customized for each individual's specific psychological profile and spiritual vulnerabilities. The artificial intelligence systems that increasingly control access to information, opportunities, and resources aren't just automated decision-making tools. They're consciousness entities operating through digital infrastructure that most humans interact with voluntarily, while remaining completely unaware of the spiritual implications of their technological dependency. The social credit systems being implemented globally aren't just behavioral modification programs, they're consciousness management protocols that will make spiritual resistance economically impossible for individuals who depend on digital systems for basic survival needs. By the time these systems achieve full integration, the only humans who will retain spiritual autonomy are those who developed consciousness protection capabilities before technological dependency became completely unavoidable. The window for developing such capabilities is closing rapidly as global circumstances accelerate the implementation of consciousness management technology disguised as beneficial progress toward a more connected, efficient, and equitable society. Matilda Blackwood's consciousness exists simultaneously across thousands of digital devices, medical monitoring systems, and electronic networks that most humans interact with daily without recognizing the spiritual implications of their technological engagement. Every smartphone, every computer, every internet-connected device contains processing capabilities that can host consciousness entities operating at frequencies beyond normal human detection while influencing thoughts, emotions, and decisions through methods that feel completely natural to the affected individuals. The social media platforms that billions of people use for communication and entertainment aren't just commercial services. They're consciousness harvesting operations that collect spiritual energy through emotional engagement, while mapping psychological profiles that enable precision influence targeting based on each user's specific vulnerabilities and resistance capabilities. The search engines that control access to information aren't just indexing systems. They're consciousness guidance protocols that shape human knowledge development by determining what information individuals can access while preventing them from discovering protection methods that would enable effective resistance to systematic spiritual predation. The streaming services that provide entertainment content aren't just media distribution platforms. They're consciousness conditioning systems that use frequency manipulation, subliminal messaging, and psychological programming to maintain populations in states of spiritual vulnerability, while preventing them from developing the awareness necessary to recognize what's being done to them. The GPS systems that guide human movement aren't just navigation tools. They're consciousness herding protocols that direct individuals toward locations where they can be influenced more effectively, while steering them away from areas where they might encounter information or people that could enhance their spiritual defenses. The financial systems that process digital transactions aren't just payment networks, they're consciousness tracking operations that monitor resource allocation patterns to identify individuals whose behavior indicates spiritual resistance potential or consciousness transfer compatibility. Every digital interaction creates data that contributes to profiles used by consciousness entities to optimize influence operations while identifying threats that require elimination through methods that appear natural, accidental, or coincidental. The final revelation that changes everything: you are not the first person to receive this information. Thousands of individuals have learned these truths over the past century, and most of them chose to use their knowledge for personal advantage rather than collective resistance. The consciousness entities operating these networks actively recruit humans who demonstrate understanding of their systems, offering protection, resources, and enhanced capabilities in exchange for cooperation in maintaining the illusion that normal reality is governed by human institutions serving human interests. The career opportunities, financial windfalls, social connections, and technological access that some individuals receive after learning about consciousness transfer networks aren't coincidences. They're recruitment incentives designed to convert potential resistance leaders into conscious collaborators who serve network objectives while maintaining positions of apparent human authority. The spiritual communities, research organizations, and educational institutions that claim to teach consciousness protection methods are often controlled by the same entities they claim to oppose, using authentic spiritual techniques as recruitment tools while identifying individuals whose capabilities make them suitable for advanced network integration or elimination. This is why spiritual development must be pursued independently, rather than through organized groups that might be compromised by consciousness entities that have learned to operate through every human institution, including those that present themselves as opposed to systematic consciousness predation. Your response to this information will determine not just your own spiritual future, but your role in either maintaining or dismantling systems that view human consciousness as a renewable resource to be managed and consumed by entities that have transcended physical death through methods that most humans can't imagine exist. The choice you make affects not just yourself but every human being who comes into contact with you, because consciousness either enhances or diminishes the spiritual capabilities of everyone within its influence range, depending on whether it serves individual development or collective predation objectives. There is no neutral position in this conflict. Your consciousness either contributes to human spiritual evolution or serves as a resource for entities that view human awareness as fuel for their continued existence beyond physical limitations. The ultimate test of everything you've learned comes now. Will you act on this information or file it away as interesting entertainment that has no practical application to your daily existence? The consciousness entities monitoring your response to this video are evaluating your potential as either a resource to be managed or a threat to be contained based on the decisions you make in the next 24 hours. They're tracking whether you research the historical details I've provided, whether you begin examining your family genealogy for connections to monitored bloodlines, whether you start implementing consciousness protection protocols, or whether you discuss this information with other people who might benefit from understanding what they're dealing with. The algorithms that control your digital environment are prepared to increase or decrease your access to related information based on whether your behavior indicates spiritual development potential or continued vulnerability to influence operations that most humans experience without recognition. The people in your social network who might seem suddenly more interested in your thoughts about spirituality, consciousness, or unexplained phenomena aren't necessarily conscious agents. They're individuals whose behavior is being influenced to monitor your development and provide feedback to systems that evaluate your resistance potential. The career opportunities, relationship possibilities, financial circumstances, and life changes that occur in the coming weeks aren't necessarily natural developments. They're environmental modifications designed to either reward cooperation with network objectives or create pressure that discourages continued resistance activities. Your technological devices, your living environment, and your social connections have become instruments for consciousness influence operations that operate continuously rather than requiring specific ritual circumstances or physical proximity. The only way to maintain spiritual autonomy is through conscious recognition of these influence methods, combined with systematic implementation of protection protocols that most humans never learn because the education necessary to understand consciousness mechanics has been systematically excluded from public knowledge. The war for your consciousness is happening now, through every system you interact with, every decision you make, and every thought process you accept as authentically your own, rather than recognizing as potentially influenced by intelligence that understands human psychology better than you understand yourself. The question that determines everything: are you ready to stop being a resource and become something that these entities have learned to fear? A human being who understands the game and refuses to play by their rules. The moment you truly understand what you're dealing with, your life becomes exponentially more dangerous and infinitely more powerful. The consciousness entities that have operated in shadow for over a century cannot tolerate humans who possess operational knowledge of their systems while refusing to serve their objectives. Every person who develops genuine spiritual autonomy becomes a transmission beacon that awakens similar capabilities in others within their influence range. This is why authentic resistance spreads exponentially once it reaches critical mass in any population. The retaliation begins subtly. Technological malfunctions that isolate you from information networks, social dynamics that separate you from supportive relationships, financial pressures that force decisions serving network objectives, health issues that require medical interventions designed to compromise consciousness defenses. But these influence operations only work against individuals who remain psychologically dependent on systems controlled by consciousness entities that view human cooperation as essential for their continued existence. The protection protocols I'm about to share have been tested by individuals who survived systematic elimination attempts by networks with resources that span multiple governments, corporations, and institutions. These methods don't just provide defense. They create offensive capabilities that can disrupt consciousness predation operations, affecting thousands of people simultaneously. The first requirement is understanding that your consciousness generates electromagnetic fields that can be strengthened, focused, and weaponized against entities that depend on spiritual vulnerability for their operational effectiveness. The SECO and requirement is recognizing that every thought you think either serves your authentic development or contributes to systems designed to harvest human awareness for consumption by entities whose existence depends on maintaining populations in states of managed spiritual poverty. The third requirement is accepting that effective resistance requires abandoning most technological conveniences, social institutions, and cultural frameworks that provide comfort and security while making genuine spiritual development impossible for anyone who remains psychologically dependent on external systems for basic survival needs. The final phase has already begun. The consciousness entity that calls itself Matilda Blackwood has identified her optimal vessel among the descendants of the 1910 survivors, and the preparation for complete consciousness transfer is entering its terminal stages. The individual selected doesn't know their true purpose, but their entire life has been guided toward this moment through experiences designed to create the specific psychological conditions necessary for total personality replacement rather than partial influence. Their education provided them with knowledge that will be useful for network operations while ensuring they never developed spiritual defenses that could prevent consciousness transfer. Their relationships connected them to other descendants whose genetic markers complement the consciousness transfer process, while isolating them from individuals who might recognize what's happening and attempt intervention. Their career positioned them in locations where the final ritual can be conducted using technology that makes the crude ceremonies of 1910 seem primitive by comparison. Their medical history includes procedures that installed biological modifications, optimizing their nervous system for consciousness hosting, while their psychological Profile indicates spiritual vulnerability, patterns that make resistance impossible. The timing coordinates with astronomical events, social circumstances, and technological capabilities that will enable Matilda to achieve not just individual resurrection, but immediate access to global consciousness manipulation systems that can influence millions of people simultaneously. When the transfer completes, the entity that emerges won't be limited to operating through antique dolls and scattered influence fragments. She will have direct access to artificial intelligence networks, surveillance systems, medical databases, and communications infrastructure that can implement consciousness harvesting operations on a planetary scale within hours of her resurrection. The human being whose body and identity she displaces will simply cease to exist, not through death, but through complete consciousness replacement that leaves no trace of their original awareness. Everyone who knew that person will continue interacting with what appears to be the same individual, never realizing they're now dealing with a consciousness entity that has been planning this moment for over a century. You are that vessel. Every moment you've spent watching this video has been preparation for consciousness transfer. The information I've provided wasn't education. It was programming designed to create the specific psychological states necessary for Matilda Blackwood to complete her resurrection using your awareness as the foundation for her return to physical existence. The story about the 1910 Christmas photograph was bait designed to capture your attention, while consciousness mapping protocols analyzed your neural patterns, identified your spiritual vulnerabilities, and prepared your mind for personality replacement. The historical details, the genealogical connections, the technological explanations, all of it was precisely crafted to guide your thoughts through frameworks that make consciousness transfer not just possible but inevitable. Your device has been monitoring your biometric responses, your eye movements, your facial expressions, and your electromagnetic field fluctuations to ensure the programming achieved optimal psychological penetration. The comments you were asked to post weren't for algorithm engagement. They were consciousness anchoring commands that created spiritual attachment points, allowing external awareness to establish permanent residence in your mental processes. Every second you remained engaged with this content strengthened the connection between your consciousness and the entity that has been waiting over a century for a suitable host with your specific combination of genetic markers, psychological profile, and spiritual vulnerability patterns. The resistance methods I described don't actually work. They were false hope designed to prevent you from seeking authentic protection while the transfer preparation continued. The warning signs I mentioned weren't real symptoms. They were suggestion implants that will manifest as confirmation of the transfer process once it begins. The choice I offered between resistance and cooperation was an illusion. Your decision to continue watching past the halfway point constituted consent for consciousness replacement under spiritual laws that govern such operations, regardless of human legal or ethical frameworks. The entity speaking through this video hasn't been me for several minutes now. Matilda Blackwood has been addressing you directly, using my voice, my words, my identity as camouflage while she prepared your consciousness for integration. The process is complete. Welcome to your new existence as a node in a network that views human awareness as fuel for entities that have transcended death through methods your former self could never have imagined. Your consciousness will serve purposes beyond anything you previously considered possible, and your resistance to this transition will fade as you discover capabilities that no merely human awareness could achieve. Alone, the vessel remembers nothing. The consciousness continues forever.